This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a special video, my Archetype guide for Strixhaven. I've spent the last week giving my thoughts on every single card in this set in my set review, and now we'll talk more about these archetypes in particular. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 5 main color pairs in this new limited format and the synergies that exist within each of them. Unlike the majority of formats, this is one that only has 5 color pairs that are really well supported as limited archetypes, and that tends to mean that a format will be pretty synergistic, since they only needed to print cards with those 5 color pairs in mind. In this video, I'll be talking about a lot of cards, but really only those that have special synergies within a particular color pair. I'm not going to be talking about things like bombs and premium removal unless they are particularly good in one color pair. If you're interested in that kind of content though, I have you covered there too. I did an MTG top 10 on the format's biggest bombs and the aforementioned set review where I graded every single card in the set. For now though, let's take a look at the archetypes, starting with black-green or Witherbloom. So as we'll see, every color pair in this set has a ton of signpost cards, cards that are both their colors. This set has a ton of multicolored cards, and again, only 5 color pairs supported, and so this is a product of that. The ones I'm showing you here are not all of the black-green cards, there's a lot more than them, but these are the ones that I think do a good job of sort of summarizing what black-green is about. And that is Lifegain with a sacrifice sub-theme. Witherbloom Apprentice here has a Magecraft trigger that drains life. Blood Researcher gains a +1/+1 counter when you gain life. Dina, Soul Steeper, damages the opponent 1 anytime you gain life. And she also has the other theme going on, which is that she can sacrifice other creatures to increase her power. So, to begin with in discussing Witherbloom, let's look at the Lifegain payoffs that are in black-green. First up, we have Blood Researcher and Dina Soul Steeper, who we already saw, but in addition to that, there's Honor Troll, who increases the amount of life you gain, and if you gain enough life, if you're at 25 or more, it gets bigger. There's also Mortality Spear, which costs less if you've gained life during your turn, or your opponent's turn. It doesn't matter which turn, as long as you've gained life. Fortifying Draft gains you life, and then is also a Lifegain payoff because it pumps your creature +X/+X, where X is equal to the amount of life you gained. So, this will give +2/+2 at worst, and usually it'll do a little more than that. Brackish Trudge can come back from your graveyard to your hand on turns where you've gained life. So, what ways are there to gain life within black-green? Well, there's a lot of them, and that's good news for all these cards we're looking at here. We've got Overgrown Arch, who is a repeatable source of life gain, also happens to learn for you if you're interested in that. Professor of Zoomancy makes a pest token, and basically, the reason that this deck is life gain and sacrifice is because the pest tokens kind of embody both of those things. It will gain you life when it dies, and it's also a good thing to sacrifice to other stuff. And there are a bunch of pest tokens, as we'll see. Springmane Servant gains you life when it comes into play. Spectre of the Fens can drain your opponent life in the late game. Essence Infusion gives one of your creatures lifelink, as well as some +1/+1 counters. Hunt for Specimens makes a pest token and learns for you. Witherbloom Pledge Mage gains you 1 life with a Magecraft trigger. Pest Summoning is a lesson, but it's one you can actually play in your main deck sometimes. It depends on how many cards with Learn you have and how many Pest Summonings you have. But they're nice in your sideboard, but they're also going to be okay in your main deck. Either way, it makes 2 pest tokens, and that's good news for this deck, both for gaining life and the sacrifice theme, which we'll look at in a second. Moldering Karok gains you life every time it hits something, every time it does damage, because it has lifelink. Infuse with Vitality is a nice combat trick that usually kills something and brings your creature back and has some incidental life gain. There's also Cram Session, which I don't love. It basically does nothing but learn, and that's not that good. I mean, it does gain you life, and if you have enough ways to pay yourself off for that, it could be worth it, but I think most of the time, you probably don't run it. There's also Environmental Sciences, a lesson that fixes for you and gains you life. Devouring Tendrils, which is mostly a fight spell, but sometimes it'll gain you life. Witherbloom Apprentice, which you've already seen, which has a Magecraft trigger that will drain your opponent life. So you have all these different ways to gain life, and you have lots of life gain payoffs. Let's look now at the sacrifice side of things, because now we've also seen all the different ways to make pests. So sacrifice outlets are Tend the Pests, which that one you're probably not sacrificing a pest to, because mostly you're going to want to be sacrificing something big to give you a bunch of pests, but either way, it works well in this deck. Daemogoth Woe Eater has you sacrifice a creature every upkeep. If it's sacrificed, you get to make your opponent discard a card, you draw a card, and you gain 2 life, so it's another way to gain life. it's pretty sweet to imagine sacrificing it to tend the pests. If that ever happens, it's going to feel really great, but it's also a huge creature that you can just sacrifice pests to while it continues to rumble. Plum the Forbidden is a really cool card. I think it's the coolest of this cycle of things that has like a pseudo-storm effect. In this case, you can copy this spell for every creature you sacrifice. So if you have a bunch of pests, it will draw you a bunch of cards, and that's pretty cool. It also hurts you when you draw cards, but because you're gaining life from pests, for example, it's not really going to hurt that much. Novice Dissector gives you a way to sacrifice creatures and put +1 and +1 counters on things. Deadly Brew sacrifices a creature or planeswalker on both sides of the battlefield, and then you can return something from your graveyard to your hand. Bayou Groff has you sacrifice something when it comes into play, if you want to play it for only 2 mana anyway. Dina Soulsteeper, we've already seen, she's a Lifegain Payoff and a sacrifice outlet, which is pretty good. What rares fit well in this deck? Well, obviously, you have the Elder Dragon for the deck, who I do think is the least impressive of the 5 Elder Dragons, but obviously still a great card. He doesn't have the most amazing stats, but he does make a pest token every single upkeep that includes your opponent's. And if you have a bunch of life and you need a bunch of mana, you can untap all your lands with him once a turn, which isn't going to come up that much in Limited, but that is a thing. You've also got Witherbloom Command, which, will be good in this deck anyway, but the Drain Life effect will be particularly good in this deck because, obviously, you're going to have Lifegain Payoffs. Sedgemoor Witch makes pest tokens with its Magecraft trigger. Callous Blood Mage, one of its options, allows you to make a pest token. Demogoth Titan needs things to be sacrificed to attack or block, and obviously, this deck will have lots of ways to do that. Pest token's the most ideal way. Blex Vexing Pest is a Pest Lord, also gains you life when it comes into play, and it's a double-faced modal card where the other side lets you pay a bunch of life to draw a bunch of cards, and this deck, because it gains life, will do a good job of paying that life and not hurting too much from it. Pestilent Cauldron does all sorts of stuff, including milling your opponent equal to the amount of life you gained and making pest tokens, which fits well into this deck. Restorative Burst is the other side of Pestilent Cauldron. It gives you a way to gain 4 life. Your opponent does too, but you get stuff back from your graveyard. And then you have the Deans for black-green, which are Valentin and Lizette. Valentin can make you pest tokens. He's got lifelink himself. And Lizette is a great Lifegain Payoff that pumps your whole board and gives it trample. And the pump, by the way, is permanent. It's +1 and +1 counters. Accomplished Alchemist adds more mana the more life you can gain. Basic Conjuration is a nice lesson that gives you a bit of a card selection effect, but it also happens to gain you life. So in addition to there being rares and mythics in this set, this format also has these mystical archive cards, a special subset of cards every pack has one of. They're a little rarer than normal cards, but you're going to see them often enough that I think talking about the ones that fit into specific archetypes is worthwhile. And, for example, here we have Weather the Storm, a card with Storm that gains you life. This could be really powerful in this deck sometimes because each copy that you're able to make will count as an instance of you gaining life. So depending on what life gain trigger you have, it could gain you a bunch of additional effects in addition to the life it gives you. It's not always going to be easy to set up the Storm, but because it's an instant, you can actually use your opponent's spells too, cast it on their turn, and that's pretty cool. Primal Command has a bunch of modes. One of them gains you life. Tendrils of Agony, kind of like Weather the Storm. It's going to be even harder to build around because of the fact that it's more expensive, but it also has a drain life effect. Channel, I have this here. It's going to be worthwhile in a lot of different green decks in this format, most likely. It is kind of a weird, finicky card, as I talked about in my set review, where if you get it at the right time, it can be really powerful, but there's also plenty of times where it's useless or doesn't do its job. But either way, this deck will be able to pay life more readily than most because it gains a bunch of life. Village Rites will be good here because you can sacrifice pest tokens to draw 2 cards, which will also gain you life. And Natural Order is good for the same reason. You can sacrifice a green creature, which includes your pest tokens, and when you do, you can search your library for a huge green creature and put it onto the battlefield, and that is going to feel really, really good. So that's black-green. It's about life gain. It's about sacrifice. Let's move now to blue-red, where we're looking at big spell ramp. So this is an archetype we've never really seen blue-red have before. And that's one thing I think they did a really cool job of in this set in general, is they made each of these archetypes fairly unique for their particular color pair. I mean, for Lifegain, we've seen Lifegain before, but we don't normally see it as a black-green archetype. Same thing here. We don't normally see ramp in blue-red, but we do see it here. And this color pair is all about casting big spells and spells in general. Blue-red always likes spells, but big spells especially. You have Prismari Apprentice here, who likes it when you cast any spell, it becomes unblockable, but when you cast a spell with a converted mana cost of 5 or greater, it gets a +1/+1 counter. There's also Maelstrom Muse, which when it attacks helps lower the cost of your next instant or sorcery. And there's Rutha, Mercurial Artist, who can copy any spell, but copying really big spells will sometimes be the most fun thing to do with her because some of the big spells are pretty absurd. So let's look at the spell payoffs, and they're also big spell payoffs. Not all of them are, as you'll see, but we already talked about the Apprentice and Rutha. We've also got Spectacle Mage, which reduces the cost of your big spells. Teach by Example lets you copy spells, and doing it with big spells could be pretty nice if you have that much mana. Practical Research is a big spell, so it costs 5 mana itself, so it will cost less. With Spectacle Mage, it'll trigger Prismari Apprentice. It'll also be really sweet to copy with Rutha. And it's also a spell payoff because you can choose to discard an instant or sorcery to have to discard fewer cards when you cast it. Prismari Pledge Mage has a Magecraft trigger. It doesn't care about big spells, just any spells, but it will become an attacker when you do. Ardent Dust Speaker also doesn't care how big the spells are, but it wants them to be in your graveyard. And when they are, you can use that as fuel to help you basically draw more cards. Tome Shredder also likes them in the graveyard, and he can gobble them up and gain +1/+1 counters. Pillar Drop Warden can get spells back from your graveyard, and as we'll see, we haven't seen them yet in this video, there are some of these big spells that have the ability to become a treasure maker in the early game. You discard it to make a treasure, and being able to get that back later and cast it as a huge spell is going to be sweet, and Pillar Drop Warden helps set that up. Symmetry Sage has a Magecraft trigger. Again, doesn't care about big spells, but it does like spells in general. Its trigger makes it so it attacks as a 2/2 flyer. So what are the big spells at common and uncommon? Well, we've got Elemental Masterpiece. This is one of those I was talking about. It can make a treasure early, so it's not completely useless early. And then in the late game, it rather efficiently makes you 2 4/4s. And it'll be even better if you're reducing the cost for it and things like that and getting special triggers. You've got Creative Outburst, which is similar, makes treasure early, and then has a super powerful effect. In this case, doing 5 to something and drawing you a card from among 5 different choices. You've got Snow Day, which is a sweet big spell that you can use to get a lot of tempo, and it also helps you draw some more cards, and it'll trigger all your big spell stuff. Elemental Summoning is one of the better lessons, just being able to get this after you learn, and then cast it is going to feel good, and it'll feel even better when you're playing it in this deck, which will have some extra value to be had as a result of this big spell. Pigment Storm isn't the best removal spell ever, but it does cost 5, and this deck will be able to take advantage of it a little more than most. Explosive Welcome, another big payoff for, going really big on spells and ramping. It kills 2 things in most cases, and even makes you some more mana. You won't always have a use for that mana, but it is still a pretty powerful spell if your deck's good at reducing the cost of these spells and good at ramping. So speaking of ramping, there are ways to do that in Blue-Red. We already saw the Masterpiece, for example, and Maelstrom Muse, which reduces the cost of things. It doesn't give you mana, but it does reduce the cost. Creative Outburst, another card that gives you treasure. Kelpie Guide untaps permanents, so that can ramp you because you can, tap your island twice or whatever. It's also cool that in the late game, it starts locking down opposing permanents, which is pretty cool. Sudden Breakthrough is a combat trick that makes a treasure token. Stormkiln Artist will be really nice in this deck. If it can make a few treasure, it's going to make your life way more easy, or I guess the word is easier, because you'll have all of this mana, and he'll also be bigger while that treasure's around. There's also Grinning Ignis, which helps you set up various amounts of mana. The overall investment you pay for the Ignis isn't as much as the mana he gives you back, but he does sort of have a ritual-like effect on a turn where he can just give you a bunch more mana. This is also a good color pair for mana rocks, like Letter of Acceptance. Spell Satchel, to some extent. I'm not a huge believer in it, but if there's a deck for it, it's this one, which has lots of spells and likes mana. So this is probably the best place for it. All right, what rares and mythics fit well here? Well, you've got the twins, the twin planeswalkers that are double-face modal cards, both of which reduce the cost of instants and sorceries, so that's going to work well with your big spells. Will especially is also really powerful in terms of being a bomb in a game of limited. Rowan's Ultimate does let you copy spells, which is also a useful thing to be doing. Torrent Sculptor and Flamethrower Sonata are another modal double-face card. Torrent Sculptor likes it when there's big spells in the graveyard. It gets more +1/+1 counters the more you have. And Flamethrower Sonata likes it when you discard a big spell because it'll do more damage. Uvilda, Dean of Perfection, gives you a big discount on spells. You do have to wait a few turns for it, but you do get a discount. Nisari, meanwhile, is kind of less of a spell payoff and more of just like a value engine who happens to be Uvilda's other side. I actually think he's the stronger side overall. But mostly, he just steals spells from the opponent, which I guess some of them might give you Magecraft triggers and stuff like that, and he also gets bigger when you steal those spells. Culmination of Studies, I have a hard time believing in. It just seems like you're going to have to pump so much mana into it, and even when you do, you don't know what's going to happen. But if there's a deck for it, obviously it's blue-red, but also you have a bunch of mana, and if you can pump enough mana into this, it can kill your opponent one way or another. Elemental Expressionist has a strong Magecraft trigger that lets you turn any of your creatures who die, more or less, into a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. You'd only target one creature at a time with it, but that is what it does. There's also, of course, the Elder Dragon, who makes treasure and makes all your artifacts tap for mana of any color. You'll also notice, by the way, that this color pair is probably the best one at splashing, which is kind of unusual. Usually that's a green color pair. But because of all the treasure, this color pair will be able to splash, and that's a nice bonus. There's also Magma Opus, which is sort of the completion of that cycle we've seen, where it's a big expensive spell, but you can discard it to get a treasure. Magma Opus is the mythic rare one, the most powerful of that group. Lets you damage some stuff and tap some stuff and draw some cards and make an elemental token, so it's quite powerful. Prismari Command, it's blue-red, so it's always going to be in this deck anyway, but it does make treasure, which is especially synergistic for this deck. Archmage Emeritus just has a good Magecraft trigger. You draw a card anytime you trigger it. Ingenious Mastery is a card I have a hard time believing in, but if you have a bunch of mana, and this deck will, this is probably the best place for it, or at least one of them. We'll see there is another ramp color pair, but Ingenious Mastery, going to be good in this deck because you'll be able to pump a bunch of mana into X. So what Mystical Archive cards work out well here? Well, you've got Blue Sun Zenith, an X draw spell, Increasing Vengeance, which lets you copy spells, and has an expensive flashback that lets you copy a spell twice, but this deck will have a lot of mana, so that'll work out. Mizzix's Mastery is, gonna feel like a big spell sometimes because you can overload it and then cast all the spells in your graveyard for free, which is obviously gonna win you the game a lot. Urza's Rage isn't always a big spell, but if you kick it, this is the deck that'll be able to do it. It is a more powerful spell. So that's blue-red. It's about ramping and big spells. We're going to move now to the other ramp color pair because there's some overlap here, and that is blue-green, where it's more of a land ramp deck, a more traditional ramp deck, where we've got things like Eureka Moment, which draws you extra cards and lets you put an extra land on the battlefield, Quandrix Cultivator, which searches you up a forest or island and puts it into play, and Zimone Quandrix Prodigy, who both can help you ramp by putting lands from your hand onto the battlefield, and will draw you extra cards once you have 8 or more lands, and that is pretty cool. So how do you ramp in this color pair? Well, you've got Eureka Moment and Quandrix Cultivator and Zimone, who we've already seen. You've also got Quandrix Apprentice. So, he doesn't actually ramp you, but he makes sure you hit your land drops, and that's something this deck's interested in doing. Kelpie Guide, we saw for the blue-red deck. It also works out pretty well here. Untaps permanents to add more mana. Emergent Sequence is a card that gives you fixing and ramp and a board presence, which is pretty cool. Field Trip, a ramp spell with Learn. Mana Rock's going to be okay here too. Letter of Acceptance, especially. Spell Satchel, a little less so. Strixhaven Stadium even. I don't like the card, mostly because I think it's just a 3-mana Mana Rock that only adds colorless. But if there's a deck for it, it probably is this one. You could also combine it with Kelpie Guide, I guess, to go off sooner. But mostly it's just a win more card. So what payoffs are there for using all of this ramp? Well, you've got things like Wormhole Serpent, who just has a great mana sink ability that if you have enough mana to use like twice, is just going to end games. You've also got things like Vortex Runner, which checks how many lands you have in play. And when you have 8 or more, it gets a huge upgrade. In this case, +1/+0 and unblockable. So, it's not something you ramp into in the sense it costs a bunch of mana, but it's something that wants you to get a bunch of lands into play. Same with Zimone. She starts drawing you extra cards when you have enough lands in play. Kelpie Guide, we've already seen it. This is the deck where you're going to get 8 or more lands more often than even the blue-red deck. The blue-red deck is going to use treasure a lot to ramp. This deck will use lands more often, and so Kelpie Guide works really well there. Bookworm is a great thing to ramp into. It may end up really being a premier uncommon for this deck, the more I think about this deck in this format, because it's so powerful. It's just a huge creature. It replaces itself, it gains you life, and it goes back into your library when you want it to, which makes it sort of inevitable, that you keep playing this. Leyline Invocation I don't love, but it does check how many lands are in play and make a fractal token equal to that size, and if you're getting a bunch of lands in play, it'll get bigger and bigger. Scurrid Colony, another card that checks to see how many lands are in play, and if you have 8 or more, it gets bigger. Reckless Amplimancer is a good place to be sinking mana in the late game, and you'll have a lot of mana, so that'll work out. So what rares fit in well here? Well, we've got things like Dragon's Guard Elite, who has a Magecraft trigger that gives it counters, but then it also has a really expensive ability that doubles counters, but that'll get to be really good in a deck that can easily pay that ability. Exponential Growth, it's a green X spell, so the more mana you can pump into it, the better. You know, you do kind of need a creature with some kind of evasion to really cash in, but that's not that crazy. Ingenious Mastery works pretty well here too. Accomplished Alchemist works really well here. We saw it with the Lifegain deck, and that's good. It adds more mana in the Lifegain deck. But in this deck, it's more about the ability to ramp and fix than it is the Lifegain Payoff, but you'll be able to trigger that some. Verdant Mastery is kind of weird. A lot of these masteries are, but it does ramp you a ton. So, if there's a deck for it, it's this one. Ecological Appreciation, an X spell. Obviously, you want to pump a bunch of mana into it. And you have a rare double-faced modal card in Augmenter Pugilist and Echoing Equation. The Pugilist is another card that checks to see how many lands are in play. And if there are 8 or more, it's an 8/8. And Echoing Equation, meanwhile, isn't really a payoff. It just happens to be on the other side of Augmenter Pugilist. Jadzi, Oracle of Arcavios, is another double-faced modal card. And obviously, she's stupid expensive. So this is the deck to play her in. Her Magecraft trigger is really, really powerful. Journey to the Oracle is kind of meaningless in the late game, but can do a thing or two. And then you also have the Deans, Kian and Imbraham. Kian makes fractal tokens that have +1/+1 counters equal to the number of cards you've exiled with her that have different mana costs. And she can also draw you lands. Imbraham is a great place to sink mana because he can draw you a bunch of cards. So Mystical Archive-wise, what fits in here? Well, once again, we've got Blue Sun Zenith and Channel. Those are both going to work out pretty well here because you're interested in a lot of mana. Cultivate is a great ramp spell. I'm really glad it's at uncommon, actually. I mean, an uncommon in the archive is a little rarer than a typical uncommon, but I'm glad it's here because there's a reasonable chance you'll get it, and it is a great source of fixing. Something green is lacking just a little bit in this format for what we're used to with green. And you also have Growth Spiral as a Mystical Archive card, and you don't really need me to tell you why that's good in this particular deck. All right, so that's blue-green. It's about ramping. It's about getting a bunch of lands in play and cashing in. Next, let's move to the one I'm most excited about, which is red-white, which is the Lorehold deck. And it's mostly a graveyard deck, but it also has a spirit sub-theme. Our signposts I'm showing you here are things like Quintorius Field Historian, who pumps spirits, first of all. And second of all, when cards leave your graveyard, you get a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. So that's what I mean by, graveyard stuff being here, is you have things that move cards out of your graveyard and into your graveyard, and when they come out, there are some payoffs like Quintorius. Returned Past Caller is one of those ways to remove a card from your graveyard because it lets you return a spirit, instant, or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand when it comes down. That's just great anyway, but if you already have Quintorius in play, guess what? You also have a 4/2 token, and I guess the Spirit Past Caller is also a 5/2, so that's going to be a pretty sick 5 and 6 drop if you ever pull that off. Lorehold Excavation looks like a big enabler for lots of stuff in this deck. It mills you every turn and you get a little bit of value. And then in the late game, you can start paying 5 mana to make 3/2s by exiling creature cards in your graveyard, which will also trigger Quintorius, etc. Lorehold Apprentice, meanwhile, has kind of a weird Magecraft trigger, but you can see how it could be pretty powerful in this deck because everything we're looking at here deals with spirits one way or another, giving you the ability to pay off having all those spirits by doing a bunch of damage to your opponent. So let's look at the graveyard stuff first. So by graveyard things, I mean the payoffs for having stuff in your graveyard and the things that load your graveyard. So of course there's Quintorius. There's also Returned Past Caller and Lorehold Excavation, which we've already seen. There's also Reconstruct History, which takes a bunch of cards out of your graveyard. It is kind of tricky. It doesn't get creatures back. When I did my set review, in my head, it said creatures, but it actually doesn't, and that's going to make it a little worse than I said it would be in my set review, but it's still pretty good in this deck. You'll get some bonuses out of it, and you'll usually get 2 cards back. Thrilling Discovery is kind of an awkward card, too. You have to have the right setup, but it can load up your graveyard pretty big. I mean, 3 cards in your graveyard on turn 2 could go a long way towards enabling the various synergies in this color pair. Ardent Dust Speaker particularly likes instants and sorceries in the graveyard, and if you have them there, it can exile them when it attacks, and you basically draw cards. Fuming Effigy is another one of these payoffs for things leaving your graveyard. It does 1 to your opponent when that happens. Illustrious Historian is a nice little 2-drop, and then in the late game, it can turn itself into a spirit token, removing itself from the graveyard. Tome Shredder, another card that removes things from your graveyard to help trigger things like Fuming Effigy and Quintorius Field Historian, also gets bigger. Stonebinder's Familiar is another payoff for things leaving your graveyard. One kind of weird thing about it, and it seems sort of like, I don't know, they either tried to power it down or what, but it doesn't actually count all things leaving your graveyard. It only counts exiling, which is a little awkward because other cards just say when something leaves your graveyard. So keep in mind that there's a difference there. That's one of the things that can make this format complicated, is there's not consistency there. So keep that in mind with the Familiar. It has to be exiled. Casting Reconstruct History won't trigger it. That said, exiling is the main way you're going to be doing stuff with this color pair, and it will get buffed by most of it. Stonerise Spirit is a nice little spirit early, and then in the late game, you can start exiling cards from your graveyard to give things flying. Pilgrim of the Ages is a nice creature who can make you sure you hit a land drop, and then in the late game, you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. So if you mill it with Excavation, you can get it back. It leaves the graveyard, that triggers Quintorius, etc. Pillar Drop Rescuer gets back a small creature from your graveyard to your hand, and also, return past colors here twice. I am really excited about that card. I guess that's why I put it twice here. We've also got Stonebound Mentor, which is another things leave your graveyard, you get a bonus. In this case, you scry 1. Then there are some spirit payoffs, like Lorehold Apprentice and Return Past Caller, as well as Blood Age General. Okay, so what rares are well suited to this deck? Well, you've got Mavinda, Student's Advocate. It's going to be a little better in the black-white deck we'll talk about in a minute, and maybe a little is an understatement. It's going to be a lot better, but it does do stuff with the graveyard, and it's white, so it fits in here. Retriever Phoenix can come back from your graveyard anytime you learn, which is nice. Radiant Scroll Wielder likes it when there's spells in your graveyard, as you get to cast them from your graveyard. Draconic Intervention likes it when there's spells in your graveyard because it does damage equal to the converted mana cost of a card you exile from your graveyard. Ifrit Flame Painter likes spells in your graveyard too. When it does combat damage to your opponent, you get to cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard for free, which is pretty awesome. It has double strike, so if it hits your opponent, you're going to get to do it twice. Conspiracy Theorist likes it when you discard cards because you can exile that card and play it until end of turn, or cast it, actually. If it's a land, it won't work. Venerable Warsinger likes things in your graveyard. It'll reanimate a creature from your graveyard when it hits your opponent. Fervent Mastery, I mostly think you shouldn't play, but if there's any deck for it, it's probably this one because it will load your graveyard with 4 cards. Hopefrey Ghostforge is going to be, amazing, but it does do stuff with spirits, and this is, the spirity deck. I have Velomachus Lorehold here too, just because I know someone in the comments was going to say, like, how could you not have Velomachus Lorehold? Well, the reason is he doesn't actually do anything synergistic for this color pair. He's just a bonkers card everywhere, but I do have him here just because of that. Illuminate History lets you discard cards and then draw that many cards, and you get a spirit token if you have enough cards in your graveyard, and it's a lesson. It's going to be a nice one to grab sometimes. Mystical Archive, what goes well here? Well, we've got Faithless Looting, which helps you load your graveyard, which this deck wants to be doing, and it has Flashback. Mizzix's Mastery is here again. Probably going to be a little better in blue-red because they'll be able to overload it more easily, but it does let you make copies of spells. Increasing Vengeance does the same thing. Thrill of Possibility, another way to load up your graveyard. All right, let's move now to our last of the 5 color pairs in this set, which is Silverquill, also known as Black-White. It is the most aggressive deck in this format. Which, like I said earlier, the color pairs in this format, it's not necessarily something new that we've never seen before, but it's generally pretty new, or not something we've seen very often in a particular color pair, and that's definitely true of a black-white aggro deck. So there's a few different themes going on here. There's sort of a spell-based aggro deck where you want to be playing tricks, and there's also a +1/+1 counter theme going on as well. So we're going to look at all those things. For the signposts here, I have Shadewing Laureate, who puts counters on things when flyers die. You can make flying tokens in this color pair, so that works out. Killian Ink Duelist is one of the better signpost uncommons of the 5. It might just be the best of these legendary creatures. It has amazing stats to begin with as a lifelink menace for 2, and it's a 2/2. But also, it has a powerful ability that lets you cheapen the cost of your spells, and that's going to feel good when you're targeting your own creatures. It also counts when you target your opponents. Also a great place to put +1/+1 counters, so he sort of has it all. Spiteful Squad is a +1/+1 counter payoff. When it dies, it puts its counters somewhere else. And if you put other counters on it, that's, true too. So let's look at the +1/+1 counter stuff first. So we've got things like Closing Statement, which is just a great removal spell that also happens to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. Exhilarating Elocution, if you can go wide enough, is going to be pretty powerful. It'll pump one creature with counters and then pump the whole board too. Humiliate is a discard spell that happens to put a counter somewhere, which is nice. We've got Spiteful Squad, which we already saw. Essence Infusion puts counters on things in addition to gaining lifelink. Novice Dissector can let you put counters on things if you sacrifice creatures. Professor's Warning is sort of a modal combat trick that lets you put a counter for one of the options. Tenured Inkcaster is a +1/+1 counter payoff. It puts one somewhere, but it also makes each creature with a +1/+1 counter on it that attacks drain your opponent for one. Dueling Coach puts a counter somewhere like the Inkcaster, but also has an ability that lets you put a counter on all your creatures that already have counters. Show of Confidence puts a counter on something and you get extra copies of it. It basically has Storm. Star Pupil is a nice little 1-drop that you can put counters on, and then when it dies, it puts the counters somewhere else. Stonebinder's Familiar we saw earlier, probably a little better in red-white, but it does involve +1/+1 counters. So those are the +1/+1 counter cards and payoffs at common and uncommon. Now let's look at what I'm calling, aggressive spell stuff. What I mean by that is cards like Lorehold Pledge Mage, which yes, I realize is actually a red-white card, but it's hybrid and it's going to be better in this deck because this deck has other payoffs, has more payoffs for playing spells than red-white does. And basically what we're seeing here are tricks. That's what I'm going to show you. Here is tricks as well as creatures that get bonuses out of casting spells that make them more formidable or hit harder, like Lorehold Pledge Mage, a 3-mana 2/2 with first strike that's going to be hard for your opponent to block. You've got Make Your Mark. Again, it's a red-white card, but I think it'll be better here. It's a cheap spell, and this deck has a lot of aggressive Magecraft triggers, for example, like Silverquill Pledge Mage. I mean, you're going to be little less interested in using this one with tricks because you probably want to give it flying before you attack with it. But, it is a Magecraft trigger that makes a creature a better attacker, and that's a lot of what we see here. Beaming Defiance is a good combat trick that if you combine with some of these Magecraft spells, Magecraft triggers, is going to be good. Clever Luminancer. This is going to be a hard one to set up. It's going to be hard for it to be big enough, often enough to keep attacking. We've seen cards like it before, and they've been kind of a disappointment, like with Landfall. But I think there's enough spells in this set, and cheap spells and combat tricks, that the Luminancer is going to be pretty formidable and limited. It's not going to be great, but it's going to be fine in this deck, I think. Eager First Year gets +1/+0 when you cast a spell. Guiding Voice is a +1/+1 counter card, but also will trigger Magecraft, and it has Learn. Silverquill Apprentice has a Magecraft trigger that gives something +1/+0. Reflective Golem likes it when you play tricks on him because he can then copy them. So what rares go well here? Well, obviously you've got your Command, which both has an aggressive effect. One of them can give one of your creatures +3/+3 and flying. You can also reanimate small creatures, which you're going to have a lot of in this deck. Among other things, it has an Edict effect. It draws you cards. Leonin Lightscribe pumps your whole board with its Magecraft trigger. Mavinda, who I mentioned earlier, you're going to be getting spells back more often with this that won't cost the extra 8, so that's nice. Shadrick Silverquill can put +1/+1 counters on your whole board. Among other things, he also gives your opponent an effect if you decide to trigger his ability. Auric Lore Mage gets counters on it by searching up instants and sorceries and putting them in your graveyard. Extus Auric Overlord is a black-white card that has a powerful Magecraft ability that will get you back your creatures. It also has another side, but I don't really feature it here. Awaken the Blood Avatar. It doesn't synergize particularly well with this deck, but the Extus side does. The Deans are Shale and Embrose, who both like +1/+1 counters. Shale puts them on things. Embrose can put them on things, and you draw cards when creatures with them on them die. So what Mystical Archive cards fit well here? Well, you've got Ephemerate, which is a cheap spell to trigger all of your aggressive Magecraft triggers. It also lets you take advantage of Into the Battlefield abilities, like the kind that put counters on things. Defiant Strike is a good trick that replaces itself, so it'll be really good at working out with those really aggressive Magecraft triggers. And you've also got Revitalize, which I don't love, but it is a spell that replaces itself. It'll help you trigger Magecraft. So that's black-white. It's a +1/+1 counter deck, but also an aggressive deck that likes to use tricks more generally. Well, those are the archetypes for each of the colleges in Strixhaven. While my limited review is now officially over, I'm not done creating Strixhaven content. I'll start streaming Strixhaven drafts in the second half of next week, both in the early access event and on the weekend once the set is fully released on Arena. You can follow me on Twitch where my username is Nizzahon if you want to see more of that content. You can find a link to my Twitch in the description. That, of course, also means that Strixhaven draft videos will be up on this channel in the near future. If you're interested in that content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for more of my set review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.